what are some lessons or takeaways that leaders / servants, if we follow the Old Testament theology professor, what are some takeaways in that context? So one component often that the sort of pastoral, more leadership-oriented person can miss this note of authenticity. And I think, on the other hand, people drawn toward the mystics often get a little bit of a kick out of the fact that other people might be rubbed the wrong way by the use of the term mystics or confused by the term contemplation. It can become its own sort of ego trip of, I get something that you don't get. It's like the cliche of people who like the bands you've never heard of. And if you have heard of them, then they don't like them anymore because they're no longer unique. And that's a certain personality type that's kind of prone to that kind of ego dynamic. So what we forget, though, because from our perspective, we are ascribing a certain cultural value and currency to figures from the contemplative mystical tradition based on the space that they occupy in our awareness or our understanding of our cultural awareness. So, for example, we might be drawn to Hildegard of Bingen and feel like it's this sort of underground figure, but understood in context, in her day, she was a leader, an abbess, and had stature and responsibility, and was an adult, and these things that some of us, especially in a more immature phase, we want to cling to symbols of iconoclasm to sort of defy the organized systems that we feel oppressed by or neglected by, or that kind of won't have us, or we can't climb the ladders in, and so we want to kind of tear them down. And so while all of the mystics were deeply authentic in pursuit of a genuine, authentic, opening experience of God that was rooted in humility and not achievement, they were often given positions of responsibility. And so we often think of Francis as this kind of gentle guy who talked to some birds and gave some sermons, but he also had administrative burdens as a leader of an order, and had to deal with probably conflict between members and kind of attacks from the outside, and all of the things that sort of contemporary organizational leaders have to deal with. Bonaventure was very much kind of this kind of worldwide traveler, was in the center of learning, centers of power, and kind of rubbed shoulders with the elite, and was named eventually the seraphic doctor of the church, but very much an administrator. We mentioned Hildegard of Bingen, even Meister Eckhart, this kind of arch iconoclast who's had some teachings condemned by the church. And if you go on YouTube, I'm sure you can find some videos that kind of elevate his stature and kind of frame Meister Eckhart as this iconoclast. As we touched on in that lecture on Meister Eckhart, he had a significant sphere of responsibility. And so all of these figures face the challenges that leaders face. So as we read their work, we need to keep that in mind. These aren't, we kind of impose, maybe in hindsight, this kind of romantic ideal from the era of the Romantics of the solitary figure, and even the term kind of desert fathers, that is somehow also incorporated in this contemplative teaching, practice, and kind of tradition, that we assume and kind of lump them all together and assume, oh yeah, those were people kind of went off by themselves and had these crazy experiences, and but they still love Jesus, and those are the mystics. But instead, they are squarely in the world, even as they remove themselves from the world to get refreshed, to go through whatever their prayer rhythm was, that was most likely very diligent, probably daily in almost all cases. But much like an activist, a leader also needs a source outside of themselves to sustain them, to guide them, to orient them. A contemplative leader needs a daily opportunity for rest, reflection, perspective, apart from their duties and tasks, apart from their responsibilities. And that alignment with a transcendent reality is one effect of the contemplative life. There's this biblical term, the firmament, which is this, in the kind of Genesis cosmology, the firmament is this kind of like dome that exists above, at the top of creation, where kind of the stars are set in. It's this kind of ancient Near Eastern cosmology that is kind of embedded at the beginning of Genesis. The firmament, you've probably seen the picture of the figure who kind of peeks outside the firmament, and that becomes kind of a picture of the esoteric or the alchemist or the mystic who kind of peeks behind reality as we understand it, as conceived of as a kind of container within which most of us dwell, and that's the limit of our understanding of reality, is the given. And here's this kind of solitary figure kind of taking a peek behind and trying to get at kind of the roots of reality, which for most people drawn to mysticism is kind of an inspiring picture, because we kind of identify with that process in our own lives. But if we take that image of the firmament as kind of this totalizing reality and sphere that we can get caught up in, our preoccupations, we wake up, especially if you're a leader in an organization, you already have 100 tasks that stand before you that day, and people who are counting on you, or who want something from you, or who need something from you, or who need you to make a decision on something. And so structurally within those positions, the contemplative leader needs an accessible point of departure from that, to see that as a self-contained entity, a system that they can peek outside of and kind of breathe some fresh air, or allow this infusion from the external outside of that system that they create, oftentimes very much in their own image, especially if they are involved in hiring their staff. Then there are people on board based on their limitations and understanding of what is needed or what they would like and prefer. And so to step outside of that is key. Now, a lot of leaders will say, well, I already do that. I pray in the morning, or I have devotional, or a men's Bible study, or whatever the format is. But we have this, as contemplatives, this kind of concentric circle understanding based on, and really the Catholics, I think in Vatican II, kind of codified this. There are 3 different types of prayer. And we Protestants kind of teach each other in our youth groups and churches and whatever, 1 kind of prayer. Maybe 2. The first is verbal, discursive, explicit, conscious, limited by whatever our frame of mind is at the time. And even in that area, we grow and develop over time, and probably move from what we think we're supposed to say to more authentic expressions in prayer to God, petition, intercessory, gratitude. That's one strand of the life of prayer. Another is reflective prayer. Reflective prayer is like those Ignatian exercises that invite you to immerse yourself in one of the gospel stories, and maybe you even move and shift characters. Sometimes it's open to your experience at the time. Which character in the story were you? Where were you standing when Jesus was walking past with a throng? An Ignatian retreat is made up of 4 weeks of a succession of those kind of reflective exercises. And that can be kind of integrated into devotion. So first is that layer of discursive prayer. Second, reflective prayer. But third, and the highest level of intimacy, is the divine silence of contemplative prayer. And centering prayer is a method kind of on the border between reflective and contemplative prayer that kind of is meant to facilitate that transition into the grace of contemplative prayer, resting in the divine silence and God's presence. With that in mind, that's where the greatest amount of rest is going to come from. That's where transformation will occur. That's what will orient toward the fruits of the Spirit, toward humility, toward the fertile soil out of which graces and good things come. And so that's why we advocate for leaders to become contemplatives. For the introvert, the mystic, the solitary figure, by temperament, we will maybe already have a framework to understand this, but so much of modern leadership is functional. It is goal-oriented with wealth, budgets, church structures, pressures, expectations, technology, family obligations, whatever else, all the demands of a pastor, say, getting a weekly sermon done, sitting with people in the hospital, being projected upon, sometimes by their staff. People have father issues or mom issues, that becomes a challenge. And then if you layer on top of that, we reserve, by and large, leadership positions for males in our culture. It's very kind of male-centric, masculine-dominated at leadership positions. And of course, some denominations certainly, or organizations. I'm not just talking about leaders in the church, but whatever the organization is, oftentimes that they tend to be male-dominated. And I think that will be changing more and more in the coming years. You can kind of feel that critical mass building. But what the male tends to do, especially if they're surrounded by other males, especially other males with a degree of responsibility, is pursuing status, pursuing things that give way to sort of a subtle form of pride through achievement, victory, competition. And we in those contexts tend to trivialize or dismiss that essential spiritual virtue of humility, which is so central to Jesus' life, his teaching, and even the teaching about him afterwards. That kenosis, his divinity, was not something to be clung to, but to be let go of. And he emptied himself. And that self-emptying being so much of the part of these mature spiritual figures of the Christian mystics. And so, if anything, they provide this model to lead by. And that path of pride is always about bending reality to our will. And sometimes we make the added mistake of confusing our will with God's will because we're in a certain position of leadership. And we jump through all the hoops of getting ordained or hired or installed or whatever. So by kind of divine right, now whatever our will becomes the divine decree. But the path of humility is always open to dynamic change. It makes its plans tentatively. It is not vindictive. It is open to the dynamic movement of the Spirit. As for the kind of committed mystic, moment to moment. And that is a dynamic, a radical kind of shift in situation frames. Learning that rhythm, that divine rhythm of the contemplative life would have a transformational effect on not just leaders, but then through them, their organizations. And so Julian of Norwich has some wisdom to share for leaders in this sense. Our desire to control the world is for her a fundamental distrust of God. We don't believe God loves us enough. We don't believe, she of course had that line, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And we don't believe in the ultimate plan of God to be benevolent and before us. And for Julian, if we understood God correctly and the universality, the profundity of his grace and love, we'd be freed from that desire, the sort of prideful desire to bend reality to our will, the anxiety that comes about from that, of the micromanagement of everything. And we could far more easily sort of let go and let God. And like so many things, it often takes some radical inbreaking of a crisis in the life. For some leaders, pastors, whatever, of course, there's the cliche of the affair or the divorce or the addicted child or something that takes them to sort of have a radical metanoia moment where they have a conversion experience into the need for change within themselves. And for mystics, of course, there's this notion, which is kind of our secret weapon in activism, leadership, whatever, of the sacred wound, and understanding the sacred woundedness of Christ as the linchpin of love, the manifestation of God's love. So in one articulation, Julian understands that God repairs the world's pain by entering into that pain and healing our history from within through an act of love, and that is the model of the Christian life. And in that understanding, the cross is the antidote to our desire to fix things through our mastery of them. And Julian devotes her life to let that antidote of love work its way into her soul. But she does realize that in this life we can't ever be fully healed of the blindness to God's love. We can continuously kind of remove the scales to see more and more clearly that divine light. And so for the mature leader, the contemplative leader, there is that participation in contemplative prayer, opening oneself to God in silence, and also embracing the mystery of the sacred wound of suffering. And from within that embrace, that transforming embrace, allowing the growth to occur that is truly aligned with the way of the cross, with God's love.